It always pays to respect your elders, especially when they're made of steel and change the face of warfare forever. Meet the grandfather of every modern tank, the tiny Renault FT. While it might look like a trash can with treads compared to today's battlefield behemoths, this pint-sized pioneer introduced revolutionary features that tanks would follow for the next century. Born from the blood-soaked stalemate of World War I, when the Western Front had become a meat grinder of trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns, this little fighter was about to break the rules and the deadlock. Origins. 1916. The Western Front is a hellscape of mud, blood, and futility. Both sides are desperate to break the stalemate. The first tanks were already rolling onto battlefields, lumbering metal monsters like Britain's rhombus-shaped behemoths and France's own Schneider CA-1. These were essentially mobile fortresses, armored beasts designed to crush barbed wire and lead infantry across the nightmare of no man's land. But Colonel Jean-Baptiste Estienne, a French artillery officer with a penchant for innovation, had a different vision. What if instead of one big tank, we build a large number of smaller tanks? They can overwhelm the enemy like a swarm of bees, and they'll be cheaper too. Estienne approached the French automotive magnate Louis Renault with his idea. Intrigued, Renault had a wooden mock-up built by October 1916. And then, nothing happened. The project slammed headfirst into the military's greatest enemy, bureaucratic red tape. And command remained stubbornly committed to their massive land battleships. Only after a dizzying carousel of changes in French political and military leadership did the first prototype finally get tested in January of 1917. Orders for 150 were placed in February. But the tangled web of French bureaucracy demanded more testing in April and May. Production finally began in earnest in September 1917, almost a year after the initial concept. Military innovation at its finest, folks. Naming. The resulting vehicle was christened the Renault FT, a name that means absolutely nothing. It was simply the next available letter combination in Renault's internal naming system. Some have romantically suggested that FT stands for Faible Tonnage, or Low Tonnage, and also Franchisseur du Tranchée, or trench crosser, but those are just fanciful myths. It's sometimes called the FT-17 for the year it was introduced, though this name didn't appear in records until after the war. Dimensions. By modern standards, the Renault FT was comically small. The chihuahua of the tank world, it weighed just 7.3 tons, or 6,589 kilograms. It stood barely 7 feet or 2.13 meters tall, and stretched a mere 11.5 feet or 3.5 meters long. That's 16.25 feet or 5 meters if you count its trench-crossing tail. At just over 5.5 feet or 1.71 meters wide, this tank was narrower than most SUVs on today's roads. You could practically park 3 of them in a standard garage. Weapons. Like other tanks of the era, the Renault FT came in male and female versions. The male had a Puteaux SA-18 37mm cannon, while the female was armed with an 8mm M1914 Hotchkiss machine gun. This armament might seem pitiful compared to other tanks of the time, but the Renault FT had a revolutionary trick up its sleeve. Its weapons were mounted in a fully rotating turret, giving them a 360-degree firing arc, the first tank to feature this game-changing innovation. While armored cars had used turrets before, this was the first time that one had appeared on a tracked vehicle. This single feature was so revolutionary that virtually every tank since, from the mighty World War II Tiger to today's Abrams, has followed suit. It's like Renault had invented the tank equivalent of the wheel. Crew. Unlike other World War I tanks that needed enough crewmen to field a basketball team, the Renault FT required just 2 brave souls, a driver sitting in the hull and a commander standing behind him operating the turret weapons. Comfortable? About as much as wearing a suit of armor in a phone booth during a heat wave. But efficient? Absolutely. Armor. Protected by steel plates between 8mm thick on the hull and up to 22mm thick on the turret, the Renault FT could shrug off small arms fire with ease. Of course, a direct hit from artillery would still turn it into a very expensive coffin, but hey, that's the risk you take when driving what amounts to be a motorized tea kettle into a battle. Engine and performance. The Renault FT pioneered another feature now standard on modern tanks, a rear-mounted engine. In this case, a Renault 4-cylinder beast pumping out a whopping 35 horsepower. Yeah, that's less power than many modern sit-on lawnmowers. This mighty power plant propelled the tank to blistering speeds of around 5 miles or 8 kilometers per hour. Pedestrians could outwalk it, but that was blazing fast by 1917 tank standards. Its operational range was about 22 miles or 35 kilometers. Not exactly a cross-country cruiser, but more than sufficient for its intended role supporting infantry at the front lines. Production numbers and variants. Once production finally kicked into gear, the Renault FT became the Model T of tanks. Around 3,700 were built by war's end, making it the most mass-produced tank of World War I by far. For comparison, the British made just 400 Mark V tanks, while the Germans managed a paltry 20 A7Vs. The Renault wasn't just winning the innovation race, it was dominating the numbers game too. As designers figured out this whole new tank concept, numerous variants emerged. Command and control versions, the FT-75BS with a howitzer, and anti-tank versions sporting bigger guns. It was like watching evolution happen in fast forward. Other users. The Renault FT became the iPhone of the tank world. Everyone had to have one. When Renault couldn't meet demand, other manufacturers stepped in, including American factories. The Americans made their own slightly modified version, the M1917 6-ton, while still producing tanks for France. Allied nations during the war, including Britain, Italy, Belgium, Russia, and the United States, all received shipments. After the war, the tank, or localized variants, spread to Finland, Italy, Japan, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Turkey, Romania, Germany, and countless others. It was history's first truly global tank platform. Battlefield performance and legacy. The Renault FT's baptism of fire came on May 31st, 1918, at Plessis-Chazelle. 31 tanks supported a French counteroffensive and scored an immediate success. For the loss of just 5 vehicles, they managed to cripple an entire German division. As intended, these tanks overwhelmed enemy forces with swarm tactics. Their small size and low profile made them difficult targets, and the infantry loved them because the enemy would focus their fire on the tanks instead of the soldiers. Their compact dimensions even allowed them to operate in forests, terrain impassable to larger land ships. The Renault wasn't without its flaws, though. Early versions suffered mechanical issues with radiator belts and cooling systems, but the reception was overwhelmingly positive. The French were preparing large numbers for a planned spring 1919 offensive that never came, as hostilities ceased before this could happen. After the war, many nations built their tank forces around the Renault FT. These little warriors saw action in the Polish-Soviet War and the Spanish Civil War. Remarkably, many were still in service when World War II erupted in 1939, though by then they were woefully outclassed by more modern tanks. When Germany overran France, captured FTs were pressed into service with Vichy French forces, or used by the Wehrmacht for occupation duties and training. Conclusion. The Renault FT began as a solution to a specific problem: how to cross no man's land without becoming another corpse in the mud. What emerged was a revolutionary vehicle whose DNA runs through every modern tank. Its rotating turret, rear-mounted engine, and small, efficient crew compartment established the template that tank designers have followed for over a century. This tiny ancestor may not impress with raw firepower or imposing size, but its influence towers over tank history. Sometimes the smallest innovations make the biggest impact, and the Renault FT proved that good things really do come in small packages. Cross-section of the A7V tank. One of the most iconic visual elements of the Second World War are German panzers blitzing their way across enemy territory, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. During the First World War, German tanks had a less than auspicious start. Their first attempt at a tank design was the A7V, a clunky metal box on tracks, a far cry from the formidable vehicles a quarter of a century later. In 1916, the Entente powers introduced the first tanks, hoping to break the long stalemate of the Western Front. Though limited, the success of the French and British tanks made it clear to the world that a new method of warfare had begun. Despite this, the German High Command was hesitant in adopting their own armored vehicles, and as late as 1917 were still relying on artillery and especially infantry, utilizing new stormtrooper tactics to break the stalemate. Undeterred by all of this, Germany did have some forward-thinking planners, and in May of 1917 the final prototype of the A7V, designed by Joseph Vollmer, was tested. After some modifications, production began in October, with the first A7Vs arriving at the front in March of 1918. The tank was named the A7V after Abteilung 7 Verkehrswesen, or General War Department Section 7, Transportation. The initial plan was to produce 100 A7Vs, though only 20 were actually made before the end of hostilities in November 1918. While plans were drawn up for other tank variants, none of these made it to the production line before the war's end, making the A7V the only tank that Germany actually produced. The vehicle was designated the Sturmpanzer Kraftwagen, or Assault Armored Motor Vehicle. Crew compartment. The A7V had a much larger crew than its French and British counterparts, usually 18 men. These consisted of an officer, driver, mechanic signaler, and 12 or more infantrymen to operate the vehicle's 6 machine guns. There were also 2 artillerymen on board to operate and load the cannon at the front. Sometimes they managed to squeeze up to 25 men inside the tank, mainly on the female variant. The inside of the A7V was a simple open space with no compartmentalization to separate the different sections. The engines were located in the center of the tank, with the officer and driver sitting above it, viewing the world through a cupola. Both these men wore asbestos-impregnated suits to protect them against the immense heat generated by the engines. The outside world was observed by small slits that provided limited visibility. The tank would be forced to make frequent stops as the commander reoriented himself. The rest of the crew operated the multiple weapons of the tank, including the main 57mm gun and 6 machine guns. Conditions in the vehicle were hellish, being extremely hot and cramped, and petrol fumes permeating the atmosphere. Crew members would often ride on the outside of the tank when not in combat to escape the discomfort. Access to the vehicle came from several rectangular hatches along the side of the tank. Weapons. The main armament of the male variant A7V was a bow-mounted 57mm field gun. A typical ordnance load consisted of about 180 rounds, divided between high explosive, canister, and standard munitions. Around the outside of the hull were located the 6 Maxim MG08 7.92 by 57mm machine guns, 2 on each side and a pair at the rear of the machine. Each tank would carry around 50 to 60 belts of machine gun ammunition, each belt containing 250 rounds. Though this was the standard armament, this could be adjusted based on circumstances. For example, one tank was modified into a female or all-machine gun variant, the 57mm gun replaced by a pair of Maxim machine guns. Each of the weapons was fixed in place, as the idea of a rotating turret had not been thought about by German engineers yet. As a result, each piece was constrained by a limited firing arc, especially the bow-mounted field gun. In order to bring this weapon to bear, the entire tank had to be shuffled about, which was a slow and cumbersome process. Armor. The armor of the A7V varied, being around 30mm thick at the front and 20mm at the sides. The top and underbelly of the tank was made of the weakest armor, a little over 10mm, thin enough to be penetrated by fragmentation grenades. The metal was also just regular steel, which was brittle. Even if a hit from enemy fire was deflected, the crew inside would be showered with fragments of metal. Names and artwork. Each A7V was christened by its new crew and was given a unique name. Some were given women's names like Gretchen or Lottie. Others were named after mythological heroes such as Wotan, Hercules, and Siegfried. The only surviving A7V is number 506, named Mephisto, short for Mephistopheles, a demon in Germanic folklore, associated with the character Faust, which incidentally was another named tank, number 503. Before entering battle, the crews would paint artwork on the vehicle. The Mephisto featured a red demon holding a white rhomboid, resembling the profile view of a British tank. Many of the tanks also had a skull and crossbones painted on the bow, but these would be painted over by a black and white cross patty, or German cross. After its capture, Mephisto would be repainted with a crowned British lion with its paw over an A7V. Engine. The A7V was propelled by a pair of Daimler-Benz four-cylinder petrol engines located in the center of the vehicle for a combined 200 horsepower performance. Two engines were used since there was no single engine large enough to power what would fit into the limited space of the tank's hull. These propelled the tank at around 9 miles per hour on roadways, though this was reduced to around 3 miles per hour on uneven terrain. Like its contemporaries, the A7V rode on Caterpillar tracks, increasing its traction. One advantage the tank had over the Entente designs was the armored plating of the vehicle, which covered the tracks, reducing their vulnerability to enemy fire. Fuel tank. The tank had a fuel capacity of 500 liters, or 132 gallons. Due to the engine's rapid consumption of fuel, this limited the range of the A7V to 60 kilometers, or 37.3 miles on flat roadways. Dimensions. The A7V measured in at 7.34 meters in length, or 24 feet, 3.1 meters or 10 feet wide, and 3.3 meters or just shy of 11 feet in height. They weighed in between 30 and 33 tons, and this variation was due to the manufacturing process, with each tank being made by hand with no standardization, leading to small changes between each vehicle. The boxy design was reminiscent of an armored railway car, though capable of movement under its own power. Chassis and suspension. The A7V was designed around the Holt tractor chassis, including a suspension of vertical springs. Due to the immense weight of the vehicle, the tank had a very low ground clearance, limiting its operations to roadways and flat, even terrain. In spite of the suspension, the ride was a bumpy one, and ropes were suspended on the roof of the tank for the men to grab onto and steady themselves when traveling over difficult ground. A7V in action. The A7V saw limited action during the war. The first operation was in March of 1918. There, the tanks were utilized in the spring offensive at St. Quentin. Two of the vehicles broke down before the engagement started, but the remaining A7Vs managed to help repel a British counterattack. On April 24, 1918, a trio of A7Vs were being used in support of an infantry assault at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, when they encountered 3 British Mark IV tanks, 2 of which were female variants, which just had machine guns, and a male variant which was equipped with 2 6-pounder cannons. During the fight, the British female tank's machine guns were totally ineffective against the A7V, and so they withdrew. The male tank remained and scored several hits on an A7V, disabling the vehicle, and its crew were forced to abandon it. This was the end result of the first ever tank duel in history. It was during this action that the Mephisto became trapped in a shell crater. Unable to extract itself, the crew abandoned the tank, which was later recovered by the British. It would eventually be transported to Australia, where it still resides today as a trophy and a museum piece. After its poor performance at Villers-Bretonneux, German High Command removed the A7V from active service, and the orders for 100 more vehicles were cancelled. The surviving vehicles would see limited service for the remaining months of the war, though the bulk of Germany's armored forces would consist of captured British and French tanks. After the war, most of the remaining tanks would be scrapped. In spite of the A7V's limited success, it wouldn't be the last tank in Germany's arsenal. Later German tank designs would incorporate the lessons learned from the Great War, leading to the development of some of the most famous and effective tanks ever built. Life inside a tank. The Mark V tank, 1918. The arrival of the tank in World War I heralded a whole new kind of warfare that helped to break the bitter and bloody stalemate of trench warfare that had plagued the Western Front for years. And it was the British who pioneered the way in the introduction, development, and use of these fearsome armored fighting machines. They were first introduced during the Battle of the Somme in September 1916, much to the shock and disbelief of the German soldiers. These British main battle tanks were a series of heavy so-called land ships that all had a very similar layout, with over 2,000 of them being built before the war had ended in November 1918. There were 5 main models, with the ultimate wartime one being the Mark V. This was introduced in July of 1918 and had been designed by Major W.G. Wilson, a British Royal Naval Air Service engineer, and produced at the Metropolitan Carriage and Wagon Factory at Saltley and Oldbury in the West Midlands of England. The Mark V tank was not a radical new design, just more of an updated version of the earlier Mark IV tank. 400 of these Mark Vs were built and consisted of 2 versions: the 6-pounder gun version, which was called the male variant, and the all-machine gun version, which was called the female variant. 200 of each were produced. The crew compartment. Like all the other tanks in the series, they were incredibly hot inside, cramped and noisy with very little ventilation. The crew of 8 were forced to communicate by shouting, using hand signals and writing notes to one another. To make matters worse, the Mark V had a serious design flaw, and that was the new engine layout, which meant that there was the constant threat of carbon monoxide poisoning throughout the tank from badly vented exhaust fumes. And it wasn't unusual for crew members to collapse unconscious inside the tank. The driver's cabin. The one revolutionary and unique feature of this new model was that it was controlled by just one driver, using a gearbox with 4 forward gears and 1 reverse gear. This was unlike earlier models that needed 4 gearmen, 2 to control each of the tank's tracks. This previously clumsy setup had led to much confusion when driving the tank, resulting in many mistakes and accidents. The Mark V's driver had just a small slit to see out of, so if the tank was not operating in battle conditions, the tank commander would often get out and walk in front of the vehicle, signaling to the driver where to go and pointing out any potential hazards. Sat next to the driver was a gunner who operated the forward-firing machine gun. Toilets and showers, or lack of them. Despite the tank being 26 feet or 8 meters long, there was simply not the space to install any kind of onboard toilet or washing facilities, and it didn't help that the tank was already woefully overloaded with all sorts of equipment and ordnance. So despite missions often lasting for days, all that was provided for the crew were some rags and buckets for washing and other bodily functions. To empty out one of the buckets, a crew member had to open the escape hatch to throw out its contents, but in the middle of combat, these waste-filled buckets would have to stay inside for hours at a time, adding to the stench of sweat and fumes in the poorly ventilated and hot interior. Dinner service. Often food like bacon and eggs could be cooked on board by being wrapped in tinfoil and placed on the top of the hot engines to slowly cook. But the ability to make the all-important cup of tea in a British tank didn't occur for another 30 years, with the introduction of the boiling vessel in the British Centurion tank, so the crew had to boil their water outside of the tank in makeshift petrol burners. The engine. The 29-ton tank was powered by a massive 19-liter 6-cylinder inline Ricardo petrol engine. The engine produced 150 horsepower, which is the equivalent to that of a modern-day Harley-Davidson motorcycle. This gave the Mark V a top speed of 5 miles an hour, about the same speed as that of a person walking briskly. Fuel tank. Despite holding 93 gallons or 420 liters of fuel, the tank only had a range of 45 miles, and though the fuel tank was armored, it could easily be penetrated by enemy heavy machine gun fire. As the tank was powered by petrol, it could explode when hit, setting the tank on fire, disabling it completely. So many crews were incinerated in this way that specially trained salvage crews had to be formed to retrieve their bodies out of the charred hulks. The starting handle. The tanks had to be crank-started internally using a large starting handle that had to be vigorously rotated with both hands in order to get the tank engine to start. The semaphore system. The semaphore system allowed for communication between tanks using a primitive signaling system of levers and discs on top of the tank,
but this relied heavily on good visibility. Therefore, adverse weather conditions like rain or early morning fog made it next to useless. Battlefield smoke was also a problem too. The tanks also carried wicker baskets containing carrier pigeons that would have messages strapped to their legs and were released outside of the tank to fly back to base with messages. The armored exterior. The Mark V's armor had 16mm or 0.63-inch thick steel plate on the front, with 12mm or 0.47-inch on the sides, along with 8mm or 0.31-inch on both the rear and the roof. This meant that it was totally immune to all types of small arms fire, and it could also withstand heavy machine gun fire and grenade blasts on all but the rear and roof of the tank. The steel plate was just normal industrial grade and therefore quite brittle, so if the plate was penetrated, it was prone to splintering. If this happened, it resulted in small red-hot shards of metal shooting around the crew compartment with devastating effects. The crew would wear medieval-looking chainmail masks to protect their eyes, and gas masks were always close at hand. Weaponry. The male variant had a 6-pounder gun in each of the forward-facing portions of its sponsons, as well as a further 4 .303-inch machine guns scattered about the tank. One machine gun was located on each side of the sponsons, another facing backwards at the rear of the tank, and a fourth in the driver's cabin facing forward. The female variant was the same, except the 6-pounder were replaced with machine guns. 6-pounders were a short-barreled version of a British naval gun, so they didn't get stuck in the mud as they crossed the trenches or shell craters. The machine guns were the Hotchkiss M1909, which could fire as many as 10 rounds a second in short bursts. But the drawback was that the odor from the cordite propellant used in the machine gun's rounds, though smokeless, caused irritation to the eyes and lungs of the gunners inside the cramped and poorly ventilated interior of the tank. Ammunition. The 207 rounds for the 6-pounder gun was centrally stored, whereas the thousands of rounds for the machine guns were distributed about the tank next to the weapon ports for quick and easy access. The side sponsons. Turrets for tanks had yet to be fully realized, therefore sponsons were used at first. There was one located on either side of the Mark V tank. Each housed 2 weapons, one in the front of the sponson that had a very limited arc of fire and could only fire at targets in front of the tank. The other was on the side of the sponson and could only fire at targets to the side of the tank. Depending on the variant, the gun facing forward would be a 6-pounder gun on the male version or a machine gun on the female one. The side-facing gun on both variants was always a machine gun. After the war, these clumsy types of mountings were discarded as designers introduced more effective turreted designs. But a notable exception was the U.S. stopgap tank of World War II, the M3 Lee Grant. Observation post. An armored cabin on the roof of the tank was used for all-around observation, using a series of observation slits. There was also a peephole on both sides which the commander could also fire his 6-shot service revolver through if he needed to. These tanks were reasonably successful, though after the war they were gradually phased out of service, to be replaced with new tanks that had gun turrets, and smaller crew numbers and proper dedicated suspension, like the Vickers Medium Mark II, that were also equipped with radios. Some Mark Vs were used in the Russian Civil War that ended in 1920. The last recorded use of them was in August 1941, when the Red Army used 4 of them as dug-in fortifications during the defense of Tallinn against the German invaders.
The Fray Bentos boys. Life inside a World War I Mark IV tank cross-section. Deep in the heart of one of the most difficult World War I battles, a tank carrying 9 brave men survived for 3 days, stranded between a battle's 2 fronts. They left their mark on history as the longest tank action of the war. It was August 1917, and the now famous Fray Bentos tank and its crew were making their way through the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as the Battle of Passchendaele, at a not-so-speedy but very loud and bumpy 3 miles per hour. The 9-man team was made up of Captain Donald Richardson, 2nd Lieutenant George Hill, Sergeant Robert Misson, and 6 gunners, William Maury, Ernest Hayton,
Frederick Arthurs, Percy Budd, James Binley, and Ernest Brady. Their battle station was the Mark IV tank that Captain Richardson had affectionately nicknamed Fray Bentos after the well-loved British tinned meat. This Mark IV tank, which entered service a few months earlier in May 1917, was one of the most prolific tanks of World War I. The Mark IV was the first British tank to be produced en masse, changing the scope of warfare forever. With thick steel plates cut, drilled, and hardened to be used for its 12mm thick armor, the role of the male Mark IV tanks was to knock out pillboxes and machine gun nests. This is exactly what the Fray Bentos and its crew were attempting when they got fatefully stuck on the 27th of August 1917. After firing on the Somme farm, the tank ran into a ditch just after 5:45 that morning near their next target, Gallipoli farm. Originally, Richardson had been walking alongside the tank to deflect enemy fire, but after receiving wounds in his legs, returned inside just in time for it to get trapped. Despite being stuck in the mud, all was not lost for Fray Bentos. The rhomboid-shaped tank had heavy armament that the crew could still use to fire upon the German army, thanks to its 2 Ordnance QF 6-pounder guns and 3 Lewis 303 machine guns, 2 of which were positioned in the sponsons and 1 in the hull front. The crew also was carrying personal weapons that they could use for protection as they tried to unstick the Fray Bentos from the mud. Unfortunately, given the tank's position and the Germans who were in an old trench just in front, the Lewis guns were no good, aimed too low into the ground to help the tank's crew much. According to Misson's account, Hill, Budd, and Maury were hit as they went into the ditch through the very hatches designed for the crew to use to fire on the enemy with their personal weapons. Budd was knocked unconscious for 2 hours as the rest tried to rectify their newfound problem. First Sergeant Misson and Gunner Brady exited the tank under heavy enemy fire to fruitlessly try and dislodge the vehicle using the equipment strapped to it. Feeling bullets ricocheting around him, Misson jumped back in the tank, but it was tragically too late for Brady. He was shot and his body fell under the tank and sank into the mud as his crewmates watched, unable to do anything. If things didn't look sticky enough for the Fray Bentos, the Allies on their own side also started sniping at the tank in an attempt to prevent the Germans from taking it, and suspecting the crew dead or long gone. But they were still alive and willing to fight on. For a total of 3 days and 2 nights, the men of the Fray Bentos endured enemy fire and horrible conditions inside the 28-ton tank. It may have been a marvel of modern warfare and an effective weapon, but life inside was hardly peachy. Despite its armor, shrapnel still penetrated the hatches, injuring the crew inside in what were called sprays of hot molten metal. They didn't dare leave as they were experiencing enemy fire from all directions, and the Fray Bentos wasn't designed for prolonged multi-day attacks. It didn't have comfortable modern trappings like a toilet or even a water station. Instead, the men were forced to endure temperatures that could reach over 30 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and drop below freezing at night. The only available liquid was from water in the radiator or filthy, muddy water from where they were grounded. Having no other choice, that was what they drank in order to stay alive. Things were looking dire. At one point, a German soldier even succeeded in making it to the tank and dropped a grenade inside, which the British soldiers promptly threw back out. At around 7 p.m., over 12 hours since the tank first got stuck, with all but Binley wounded, Captain Richardson made an executive decision to tell Misson to head back to the British infantry and tell them to stop firing. If they were to get out of this alive, it wouldn't do to be shot by friendly fire just as they escaped the Germans on the other side. Of course, the Germans didn't get the memo and continued to fire on the tank for the next 3 days across the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of August 1917. Above all else, the crew of the Fray Bentos were determined to do their duty and not let the tank fall into enemy hands. Any tank lost to the Germans would be a massive blow to their offense. Despite the war nearing its conclusion, the Germans hadn't focused on tank warfare and had none of their own to retaliate against the Allies. Instead, they focused on defense or repurposing those they captured, which was why it was imperative Fray Bentos stayed out of their hands. But life inside the Mark IV wasn't pleasant. Putting aside the enemy fire, wounds, potential shrapnel, heat, and muddy water, A cramped tank wasn't a great living space at the best of times. The only place to sit was beside the 70-gallon engine and transmission. This meant that while in the tank, on top of everything else, the crew was assaulted by a cloud of gas, carbon monoxide, oil smoke, and cordite from shells that they inhaled every time they breathed, leading to nausea and long-term side effects. It was cramped and intimate, and not in a good way, with the transmission noise so loud that the crew often had to scream at each other to be heard. In fact, braving the outside probably seemed less horrific in some respects, because at least the air was somewhat fresher. The fight with the weary Fray Bentos boys continued on until the 24th, when Captain Richardson decided enough was enough. After over 60 hours of constant assault, they would make a break for it back to British lines, taking not only their weapons and maps, but unhooking and taking the Lewis guns also. The crew exited the tank at 9 p.m. August 24th. Forced to literally crawl on their bellies across the mud, the remaining members of the Fray Bentos tank crew, sans Brady, slowly made their way to the British lines. Finally, after an arduous journey and a record-breaking extended siege in their tank, the surviving crew had made it. They encountered the 9th Battalion, also known as the Black Watch, who took the weary men in and tended to their multiple wounds. The battle for the Fray Bentos was over, and luckily, the Germans never succeeded in capturing the tank for themselves. All the men who had endured the 3 days inside Fray Bentos received recognition for their calmness and stoicism under heavy fire. Captain Richardson and Second Lieutenant Hill received the Military Cross, while Misson and Maury were awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The other members, Hayton, Arthurs, Budd, and Binley, received the Military Medal. Sadly, Budd didn't survive to see the end of the war, dying a year later, aged 22. Captain Richardson went on to command another tank he lovingly called the Fray Bentos II, although it couldn't possibly live up to the legacy of its predecessor. The Fray Bentos II was captured and presented to Emperor Wilhelm II. At the end of the war, the affectionately nicknamed Fray Bentos boys were officially recognized as the most decorated tank crew, undergoing the longest tank action of World War I. Fiat 2000 tank cross-section. Arguably, the most significant technological development of the First World War was the creation of the tank and the way in which they rolled their way inexorably across no man's land, changing the nature of warfare forever. Tanks that were designed by the British, the French, and the Germans are the best known and are the basis of modern-day armored vehicles, but some other nations, which are often overlooked, also contributed to the development of tanks. In order to try to gain an advantage on the battlefield, Italy set out to develop a tank of its own, resulting in the Fiat 2000, an innovative, if forgotten part of the Great War. Origins. Italy entered the war in 1915 alongside the Allied powers, their primary adversary being the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with most of the fighting taking place in the rugged terrain of the Alps. As early as October 1915, Italian car manufacturer Fiat began development of an armored vehicle that would, hopefully, give the military an edge over their opponents. However, the process was so slow that the government turned to the French, who delivered a Schneider CA-1 and later on Renault FT-17s, which became the backbone of Italy's tank force. It wasn't until 1917 that the Fiat design was finally ready for testing. Compared to the 6-ton Renault or the 15-ton Schneider, the Fiat 2000 was a gargantuan 40-ton behemoth of a vehicle. Testing was started in June of 1917 with the first prototype, although it was an incomplete vehicle. The mechanics of the main body hull were in place, but the superstructure consisted of a wooden mock-up, since the actual metal parts weren't finished. Later on, a second prototype would be made with some alterations to the basic design. Only 2 prototypes of the Fiat 2000 were created, and though very similar, there were slight differences between them. The most obvious difference is the armor plating, with the metal skirt of prototype number 1 being made of several armored plates welded together, whereas prototype number 2 being made of a single piece of metal. The exact arrangement of the weaponry was also slightly different, with the machine guns of number 1 being placed directly front and back, while those on number 2 placed at the corners of the superstructure. Dimensions. The Fiat 2000 was an immense vehicle, one of the largest produced during the First World War. It was much heavier than any other tank of the conflict, including the German A7V. It was just over 24 feet in length, 10 feet wide, and 13 feet in height. The boxy structure made the tank resemble a pillbox, and many contemporary sources refer to the vehicle as a mobile fort armament. The Fiat 2000 was heavily armed, though, capable of dishing out a tremendous amount of firepower. The primary armament was a 65mm howitzer, which was a compact artillery piece that was designed for use in the mountains. The gun would be placed in a dome-shaped turret on the top of the vehicle, which could rotate 360 degrees, with a depression of -10 degrees and an elevation of 75 degrees, giving the tank a wide field of fire. To protect the tank and its crew from enemy infantry, it had numerous portholes located around the hull that could be fitted with up to 8 Fiat Ravelli 6.5mm machine guns. The machine guns were positioned with various configurations, with the intention of covering the tank from all angles. Armor. The Fiat 2000 armor was thick by First World War standards, ranging from 10 to 15 millimeters on the sides and rear, and up to 20 millimeters at the front, more substantial than most of its contemporaries. The structure of the tank did slope upward slightly, though at too shallow of an angle to be considered true sloped armor, which meant that the tank relied on the thickness and toughness of the armor plating to deflect enemy fire. Crew. The number of crew originally allocated to a tank was set up for 10 men, though most of these operated the machine guns, but since it was unlikely that all of the weapons would be needed at the same time, the crew would likely be reduced to around 8. The driver sat in the center at the front of the tank and viewed the world either through a periscope or, if circumstances permitted, through a large hatch at the front of the vehicle, though this would place the driver and the rest of the crew at risk and would only be done when not in a combat situation. The crew would enter through a hatch on the left side of the tank and would position themselves in the designated crew compartments, which was located above the engine, transmission, and other internal workings, separated by a bulkhead. With the crew compartments separated, the men had more room to maneuver compared to the tanks of other nations. Power plant and performance. The vehicle was propelled by a single 6-cylinder Fiat A12 aviation engine, which had a power output of around 250 horsepower. The engine was primarily used in aircraft, and as a result, the tank ran on aviation fuel. Because of the immense weight of the tank, the top speed of the Fiat 2000 was around 4 miles per hour on flat, even surfaces, about the speed of a brisk walk. This was not seen as detrimental, since at this point, tanks were seen as ways to support infantry advances, rather than striking out on their own. And so having a top speed faster than an infantryman could advance was unnecessary. Service life. Though innovative in its own way, the Fiat 2000 was ultimately a failure. It was just too large and cumbersome to be of any use on the narrow mountain passes of the Alps, where the bulk of Italy's fighting was taking place. Another issue plaguing the process was the slow speed of development. Though the idea initially started in 1915, it wasn't until 1917 when the first prototype began testing, and this was just the hull, lacking the proper superstructure, with the second vehicle remaining unfinished until February 1918. The program was cancelled on November 4, 1918, just days before the ending of hostilities. Prototype number 2 was deployed to the Piave River, the site of the last Austro-Hungarian offensive into Italy during the war, though there's no indication that it was used in combat, and was likely just there to conduct tests. After the war, no further prototypes of the Fiat 2000 were built, though they did see some combat. In 1919, revolts in parts of Italian-held Africa led to the deployment of at least one tank to Libya. Sources are unclear as to whether both prototypes were sent, or only prototype number 2. In any event, either one or both of the tanks were part of a force sent to recapture the city of Jarabub, although exactly how they performed this in the campaign is a mystery. In spite of this, Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi depicted the Fiat 2000 on a series of stamps, including a commemoration of a battle that occurred in 1913, well before the Fiat 2000, or the very idea of a tank in general, even existed. The ultimate fate of the two prototypes is also a source of debate and speculation by historians. The last known photograph of prototype number 1 was taken in 1924. An inventory of vehicles and equipment taken in 1925 and 1926 lists only one tank. Prototype number 2 is known to have existed into the 1930s, so its companion is presumed to have been scrapped, though this cannot be confirmed. As late as 1934, prototype number 2 was modified, replacing the forward-facing machine guns with 37mm cannons. It was used for training as well as propaganda purposes, though its eventual fate is unknown. Shortly after this modification, the final Fiat 2000 disappeared from records and history, presumably having been scrapped. By the time the Second World War broke out, it had disappeared without a trace. As it was only Italy's first attempt at a tank design, it was quite innovative in its own way and did include features found in modern tanks, such as a rotating turret. It ultimately proved unsuitable for combat and was far outstripped by other tank designs. The next Italian tank to be produced was the Fiat 3000, which was based on the French Renault FT. When it was created, tank design was still in its infancy, and the Fiat 2000 was a creative attempt to build an effective vehicle from the ground up, an experiment that represented the growing pains of a new type of warfare, one which would eventually dominate battlefields around the world. In 2017, work began on creating a full-sized replica after a 1/5 scale wooden model was found and purchased by an Italian military vehicle restoration group, Spa Militaire. After crowdsourcing financing, the group managed to build a fully functional replica of the original, which was completed in 2020. It now resides at the Museo Civico delle Forze Armate, 1914 to 1945, in Vicenza, Italy. In addition to being a museum exhibit, the tank was also intended to be commercialized, being used in movies, rentals, and other displays, which will help fund the restoration and recreation of other historic Italian tanks and vehicles.